Man, I love a classic American meatloaf, and over many years I think I've arrived at a particularly efficient procedure for making one. The name of the game here is minimizing dishes. I will start with an oven-safe pan. I use non-stick for this because it'll make cleanup a lot easier later, but you could use anything. And I'm going to start by grating in like 4 big carrots directly into the pan. You could cut them up on a cutting board, but that would dirty the cutting board. Plus, the pieces need to be really small. I like a lot of veg in my meatloaf, but big chunks tend to fall right out of the slices. The grater gets you tiny pieces that'll stay incorporated, and grating carrots is very quick and easy. Might as well grate my onion too while I'm at it. No reason to dirty a board or a food processor. Grating onions is very easy too. Alrighty, heat on high, and I'll pour in a little olive oil, stir that around, and get it steaming. Most vegetables have to be softened somewhat before you cook them in a meatloaf, otherwise they'll just be crunchy. Have the confidence to use high heat. There's so much water in this pan that there's no chance of anything burning as long as you keep it moving. After maybe 8 minutes, enough water will have cooked out that stuff will start to brown. That's more than enough cooking for this. Off the heat it comes, and in goes maybe a cup of breadcrumbs at the most. I'm using panko just because that's what I usually have around, but any form of breadcrumb would be just fine. And then I will stir in just as much milk as it can absorb. This will have the added benefit of cooling down the pan, which is something that I want to achieve right now. Some people say the function of breadcrumbs in meatloaf is to absorb and retain moisture from the meat. I suppose they do that, but they can hold a lot of moisture. The milk tastes good, and it makes the finished texture even more moist and soft. You could use stock if you can't eat lactose. Now, I think the main function of breadcrumbs in meatloaf is to tenderize it. The bread gets in between the bits of meat and disrupts the protein matrix that it forms when cooked. It just keeps everything from getting too hard. Okay, I'm going to let that pan sit and keep cooling down for a sec while I turn on my oven, 350 Fahrenheit, 180 C, convection if you've got it, and I'll make my glaze. A great American-style meatloaf generally has a glaze based on ketchup. That looks like maybe 3/4 of a cup I'm squeezing out. I often don't have ketchup in the house these days, so I have replaced this with roughly equal quantities of tomato paste, vinegar, and any form of sugar. That's basically all ketchup is. Anyway, I'll mix this with an equal quantity of Worcestershire sauce, and that's it. Mix it up. All that sweet, sweet corn syrup in the ketchup will create a beautiful, shiny, sticky shell on our loaf. Okay, now that this pan has cooled a bit, I can mix up my meatloaf right inside of it instead of dirtying a mixing bowl. 2 pounds or a kilo of basically any ground meat you want. That's 1 pound of beef chuck, and I like to mix it with a pound of ground lamb. Delicious flavor that way, but some people use all beef, some people use beef and pork. Go nuts. I'm putting in a good teaspoon of garlic powder, such a convenient way of intensifying the meaty flavor of ground meat mixes. Now, salt. It's tough to gauge seasoning with a meatloaf mix because you can't just taste it and adjust. I think a totally solid rule of thumb is 1 teaspoon per pound of ground meat. I'm doing a heaping teaspoon because I've got a lot of veg in there too. Grind on a ton of pepper, and you could put in some dried herbs, but I like to see a little green in there if possible, so I'm putting in some fresh rosemary from my plant. And rather than dirty a cutting board, I'm just snipping it into the pan with scissors. Once you've snipped most of the needles in half, you can just run your fingers across the stem to pull off the remaining halves. Now, you could just crack in 1 whole egg as a binder for this much meat, but I prefer the texture I get from using only yolks, 2 yolks for 2 pounds of meat. I suspect the emulsifiers in the yolk help the loaf to hold more fat inside it, but who knows. And then my secret ingredient, like 4 spoonfuls of that glaze inside the meat. I always used to hate how bland the interior of the loaf tasted compared to the outer bits with the glaze on them. Well, this gets a really noticeable dose of that sweet and sour goodness running through the whole loaf, and now I'll get in there with my hands and mix it up. Some people are really careful to just mix with their fingertips and to make sure that they don't get this too homogenous. I do that for meatballs, but to me, a classic meat loaf is really thoroughly mixed. I'm totally doing that squish through your fingers thing. I want slices that are solid and set, almost like gelatin. You get that by quote-unquote over-mixing. If you want a more crumbly texture, mix it way less. If you're in any way unsure of seasoning or flavoring in this, just cook a tiny bit of it right now, maybe in the microwave. Taste, adjust. Some people would transfer this to a loaf pan to bake, but since we already have this dirty pan, I say let's just bake it right in here. Ground meat is pliable stuff. You can shape it into a freestanding loaf. Just shape it a little taller than you want it because it'll spread outward a bit in the oven. Last thing is to spread on a primer coat of the glaze, just half the glaze. I'm spreading it with the back of the spoon, and I don't worry too much about the sides because it's going to drip over. We'll cook that in the oven for about an hour until its internal temperature is at least 155 to 160 Fahrenheit, like 70 C. To me, a classic meatloaf is done all the way through, and given that ground meat is particularly susceptible to bacterial contamination, that'll keep us safe, just as we can keep ourselves safe with the sponsor of this video, Surfshark. Whenever you're using public Wi-Fi, you can just connect with Surfshark, and all of your data and personal information you send will be encrypted via a secure virtual private network, VPN. This has many benefits beyond assuring privacy. Surfshark's global network of servers allows you to get around internet censorship that happens in many countries, and you can get around geo-restrictions on content. Like, I pay for Disney Plus for my kids, but if we're outside the US, we might get blocked. Well, we just route through one of Surfshark's American servers and we're in. You can also tell Surfshark that there are certain sites or apps that you trust. That's called whitelisting. It's useful for things like banking apps. Surfshark is unlimited, they've got 24/7 support, and you can get 85% off if you hit my link in the description and use the promo code AdamRagusia. 85% off Surfshark plus an additional 3 months for free. Link and code in the description. Thank you, Surfshark. Now, we can turn our attention to our sides, and I have mash and peas with basically all of my roasts. I don't apologize for that, it's what I want. But I think I have developed a particularly streamlined way of making it. Again, the order of the day is saving on dishes. I'm just using a paring knife to cut some potatoes into chunks directly into the water. I've got my burner on high, but it'll take a while to heat this water up, so I'm not worried about scalding myself. Unless your potatoes are really dirty, I see no reason to wash them before boiling them. The boiling water will effectively rinse them. Hey, check out my fancy new downdraft pulling steam away from the camera lens. I told you it'd work. Let's check on the meatloaf. About halfway through the cooking, I will put on the rest of my glaze. Doing it in 2 coats like this gets you a nice lacquered finish on the thing. If you put it on all at once, super heavy, it wouldn't have time to dry out and go sticky. Back in that goes. The potatoes start to visibly fall apart when they're about done, though I think it's good to test with a fork too. I got a lot of resistance there. I like pretty smooth mash, and to get that, you've got to boil the potatoes really soft. That's better. I'll slap the lid on there and drain the potatoes through a gap between the pan and the lid. Even if you only got the lid dirty for this purpose, it's still worth it because a lid takes up way less space in the dishwasher than a colander does. Okay, heat is off, but there's still plenty of heat in the pan and the burner. I'll melt in a couple of huge knobs of butter, and I really like some fresh chopped garlic in my mash. Here's a very easy way to make that happen. I'll move the potatoes aside so that I've got a clear patch of melted butter on the bottom of the pan, and I'll turn the heat back on for a minute. Now that the butter is fizzing, I can cook some garlic in it, and this is a great time to use the garlic press because I just need a couple of cloves. I changed my mind about these things when I realized that you don't have to peel the garlic first. The skin stays behind in the press. This is also a convenient way of using those really small cloves that would be a pain to peel. Okay, I've got my garlic down in my butter patch, and I can let it fry for a minute just to knock down that harsh raw garlic taste. While I'm waiting, I can grind in some pepper and put in a big pinch of salt to start with, and when the garlic is done, a glug of milk to start with. Now I'm going to get in there and mash. Like I said, I like it pretty smooth. Now I can taste for seasoning, needs a little more salt and a little more milk to loosen the texture, and that is done. Now I want peas, and rather than dirty another vessel for boiling the peas, I'm just going to push all my mash to one side of this pot and dump some frozen peas into the other side. Seriously, this works. Just cover it up, put the heat on low, and they will thaw in the time it takes to remove and rest our meatloaf. I'll take its temperature. Usually the coolest part is near the top for me, and it's now about 155. I'd consider that minimum for meatloaf. For the last couple of minutes of cooking, I'm going to turn my broiler on and get some nice brown color on that glaze. Just watch it very carefully because sugar burns in a flash. Look at that. My peas are half thawed. It helps to stir them, and we might as well stir in some butter while we're at it. Yes, some of my peas are going to get stuck in the mash with this method, but let me tell you, that is my end game anyway. After the meatloaf has rested for a good 10 minutes, it should be firm enough that you can just lift it out to a carving surface. And this right here is why I like to use a non-stick pan. The glaze that drips onto the exposed pan surface tends to burn, and it's way easier to scrub off of Teflon. You'll get cleaner slices on meatloaf and just about anything else if you work the knife back and forth with long long strokes as you push down. If you just push down, it'll crush the slices. Kind of wish I'd cooked that a hair longer. That texture could be a bit firmer and tighter for me. Plus, I would have gotten a smoother surface on the slices, but hey, it's meatloaf, whatever. Mash and peas on the plate and a big slice of meatloaf. We seriously only dirtied 2 pans to make this dinner. To me, that is the archetypal American family meal, beloved by people old and young for generations.
Yeah, mashed potatoes are yummy.
Oh, potatoes.